We're talking about conformity, compliance, and obedience. As much fun as that sounds, so let's go ahead and get started. Conformity is a change in behavior or belief as a result of real or imagined group pressure. Conformity tends to occur even in large groups. Is conformity good or bad? I guess that's the question. It is bad when it leads to incorrect behavior, such as drinking or driving or doing drugs because everyone else is doing it. It is good when it maintains necessary social organization, such as waiting your turn in a grocery store checkout line. Sometimes it's completely inconsequential. In Western cultures, conformity is considered to be negative. It shows submission and compliance. In Eastern cultures, conformity is seen as a positive thing: communal sensitivity, responsiveness, cooperative team play. Sometimes we modify our behavior in response to information that we receive from others. This is known as informational social influence. In many social situations, other people provide important information through their actions and words. And of course, we try to copy them because we know that that is the proper behavior for that situation. We are subject to informational social influence because we want to be accurate in our judgments. We use other people's behavior as a source of information by which to test the validity of our own behavior. We conform because we perceive that others have correct information. Shifts in behavior based on informational social influence result from the sharing of arguments and factual information. Conformity also comes about as a result of normative social influence. In this type of social influence situation, we modify our behavior in response to a norm, an unwritten social rule that suggests what constitutes appropriate behavior in a particular situation. Our behavior is guided not only by rational consideration of the issue at hand, but also by the discomfort we experience when we are in disagreement with others. We are motivated to conform to norms and to be implicit expectations of others in order to gain social acceptance and to avoid appearing different or being rejected. In a normative social influence situation, at least two factors are relevant. First, the input we obtain from others serves as a cue to the nature of the norm in effect at any given time, like standing in line or stopping at a stop sign. This results in pressure to modify our own behavior to be consistent with the norm. A good example would be in where I live in Iowa. If you're turning left and you've got somebody behind you and you don't want to slow them down, you can get into the left-hand lane if there's nobody coming towards you. Of course, you don't want to have a head-on collision. You can get into the left-hand lane to turn the corner. That way they can pass you without having to slow down. And that's a local norm. Now, I haven't seen it other places. In Texas, if you are going slower than the guy behind you, it's okay for him to drive onto the shoulder of the road and pass you if there's not a safe way to get around you on the left. Second, the size and unanimity of the majority convey information about the strength of the norm in effect. These two variables are important in determining the likelihood and the amount of behavior change in a social influence situation. Both informational and normative social influence can exert powerful control over our behavior, though their effects are different. The changes caused by informational social influence tend to be stronger and more enduring than those caused by normative social influence. This is because changes caused by new information or a new interpretation of existing information may be persuasive and convincing. Now, one of the things that we need to remember and that we need to think about is that all of the information that we're looking at, all of the studies that I have shown you up to this point are at least 30 years old. So the reality may be that what is happening on the internet now has changed everything completely. So that's just something that you need to think about as we're going through this lecture. Norms play an important role in our everyday lives. And of course, the norms on the internet are not the same as the norms in real life, IRL. These unwritten rules guide much of our social behavior. Humans seem to be predisposed to form norms and conform to them, even in the most minimal situations. What did like last week? Two 11-year-old girls were kidnapped and raped and murdered. One was in New York, and I'm trying to think where the other one was. Texas? Oklahoma? Anyway, two different places. Wow. Okay. So you don't really expect that to be happening in more than one place, but I mean, it was like one day one girl disappeared, the next day the other girl disappeared. Are we creating new norms that are dangerous for our children because the internet has no bounds? Just a thought. And what else happened? Oh, the state of Alabama declared frozen embryos from IVF. They declared them as living beings, which means that you can't do anything with them except plant them in someone's womb so that they can grow and become a human being, or grow and become a more than two-celled human being. Okay, so our norms are changing. Everything's changing. And the internet is accelerating things very rapidly. And of course, at the same time, we have to argue about whether AI can control anything. Remember, AI accumulates information, and theoretically, it accumulates all the information that's out there. So potentially, will they create a situation where whatever they say is an absolute? Because they have all the information. The human brain can't accumulate that information, but computers can, and AI represents computers. Anyway, this is just something to think about. Norms exist on many levels, ranging from broad cultural norms to small-scale situation-specific norms. In the middle of the 1930s, Muzaffar Sharif, who was Egyptian, by the way, conducted the first psychological studies on conformity at Columbia University. Sharif had three people make speculation about the movement of light in a darkened room. The next day, the three were put in the same room. By the end of the day, though their initial estimates were very different, they all agreed to a group norm. Robert Jacobs and Donald Campbell from Northwestern University repeated the experiment, but used a confederate to overestimate the movement of the light. The light wasn't actually moving at all, but was a phenomenon known as autokinetic phenomenon. If you try to hold your head still, you can't do it. And so if you're looking at a static light, if you're looking at a light that's not moving, it looks like it's wavering back and forth. The experimenters used the confederate to plant the idea of movement, and the idea persisted over 5 generations of participants. Suggestibility is a powerful force. Why? Because people said that that's the way it was. Now, of course, now that we have AI and we have theoretically instruments that accumulate all information, potentially we're going to be getting a lot of bad information, because it's also not only accumulating good information, it's also accumulating bad information. And if it puts the bad information and the good information together, maybe the bad information will win out. Researchers discovered fairly quickly that people tended to conform when they felt incompetent. Group attributes that matter. Conformity is highest when a group has 3 or more people, and we're going to see this again, the number 3. When there is a group cohesiveness, when the group is unanimous, when the group is high in status, when the response is not public, when the group has made no prior commitment. Other researchers have done work with suggestibility. Peter Totterdell has identified a phenomenon referred to as a mood linkage, where people who work together tend to reflect each other's moods. Tanya Chartrand and John Barg conducted experiments where they had a confederate make select gestures such as a nose rubbing or foot bouncing, the subject tended to copy the Confederates' movements in a response they referred to as the chameleon effect. And you can try this at home on your spouse or your kids or anybody you want. If you scratch your head, it's possible that they'll reach up and scratch their head at the same time. Suggestibility is not always harmless. It is not uncommon for people to get ideas from what other people do. Copycat murders, hijackings, UFO sightings, even suicides tend to occur in waves. After Marilyn Monroe's suicide in 1963, the number of suicides in the United States increased by 12%. Mass delusions are not imaginary. However, the circumstance usually involves people responding to otherwise overlooked symptoms. Solomon Asch conducted several experiments in the 1950s dealing with the pressure of the group. Asch conducted experiments where all the participants but one were Confederates. After a series of obvious group agreements, the group purposely all selected an obviously incorrect answer. 37% of the time, the subject went along with the group, despite the fact that it was an obviously incorrect answer. And what they were talking about, they had lines of different lengths, and then they had a line that they were supposed to compare it to. And for most of them, they got it right. Okay, it's A, it's B, it's D. But then on the one that the Confederates, the group, decided that they were going to get incorrect, 37% of the time the subject actually went along with them. Research shows that some people are more susceptible than others, but the personality tests are poor predictors of conformity. Researchers discovered that when social influences are weak, then personality is more predictive of behavior and thus of conformity. Situations certainly influences whether the individual will dare to dissent or conform. Repeating Asch's conformity experiments around the world, researchers have discovered that different cultures have different levels of conformity. 30% in Lebanon, Brazil, and Hong Kong, 51% among the Bantu tribesmen of Zimbabwe. Possibly the least conforming population were the very individualistic French, an individualism that they are now being crucified for by conservative U.S. press. And actually, they have decided to back to send ammunition, which the United States has been balking at for the last 2 or 3 months. They've decided to get together with other European countries and make sure that the Russians do not win the war in Ukraine. The first variable that can affect the amount of conformity observed relates to the task itself. One variable affecting conformity rates is the ambiguity of the task. As the task facing the individual becomes more ambiguous, less obvious, the amount of conformity increases. The more complex it is, the more people are more likely to conform. You see this with math problems. A lot of people don't like math. A lot of people have a difficult time with math. And when the brainiac in the class comes up with an answer, everybody goes, yeah, that's what I got. The type of task faced by the group may determine the type of social influence, informational or normative. That comes into play. Informational social influence should be strongest when participants face an intellective issue in which they can use factual information to arrive at a clearly direct answer. In other words, brain teasers. Normative social influence should be more crucial on a judgmental issue. A judgmental issue is based on moral or ethical principles where there are no clear-cut right or wrong answers. Therefore, resolution of the issue depends on opinion, not fact. The size of the majority also affects conformity rates. As the size of the majority increases, so does conformity up to a point. Generally, there is a nonlinear relationship between the size of the majority and conformity. Majority influence significantly increases until some critical majority size is reached. Why does conformity level off after some critical majority size? First, as majority members are added beyond the critical point, the individual in the conformity situation might suspect that the additional majority members are going along to avoid making trouble in the group. If the individual conformer perceives this to be the motive for joining the majority, the power of the additional majority members is reduced. Second, as the size of the majority grows, each new majority member is probably noticed less. The individual is more likely to notice a third person added to a majority of 2 than to notice a 10th person added to a majority of 9. Often the changes caused by the forces producing conformity are fragile and easily disrupted. This is the case when we find that there is another person who supports our perceptions and actions in a given social situation. The true partner effect occurs when we perceive that there is someone who supports our position. We are then less likely to conform than if we were alone facing a unanimous majority. This effect was first demonstrated empirically by Ash in 1951. Ash had a true partner emerge at some point during his conformity experiment. The results of this manipulation were striking. Conformity was actually increased by nearly 80%. As long as there's a true partner, as long as there's somebody that agrees with you, you're more willing to go against the grain. Why does this occur? When we violate a norm by ourselves, we draw attention to ourselves as a deviant. It makes us very uncomfortable to be perceived by others as different. When we have a true partner, we can diffuse the pressure by convincing ourselves that we are not the only ones breaking a norm. Another explanation for the true partner effect draws on social comparison process. Social comparison theory proposes that we compare our thoughts, beliefs, and actions with those of others to find out if we are in agreement. When we find out that we agree, we feel validated. It is rewarding when we receive such confirmation. Our confidence in our beliefs increases because they are shared with others. There is some evidence that women conform more than men, and that women are less confident in their judgments in the face of the majority. Though there does appear to be a consistent gender difference. Strangely, larger gender differences were found when a man runs a conformity experiment, though no gender differences are found when a woman runs the experiment. It was really kind of curious because some of the research looking at whether women conform more than men found that women do, and others that they conform less. It really all depended on who was running the experiment. When men ran the experiment, women conformed more. When women ran the experiment, the women in the experiment conformed less, as bizarre as that sounds. So it sounds to me like, and if you look at all of the research that has been done, that sometimes there is no gender difference, that sometimes men are more conforming and sometimes women are more conforming. An analysis of the research also shows that there are conditions under which women are more likely to conform than men, and others under which men are more likely to conform than women. Now remember, these are all at least 30 years old, as you can plainly see. Some of them are 40 years old, some of this research. So what was true 40 years ago probably isn't true today. Women are more likely to conform than men in group pressure situations, that is, under conditions of normative social influence, than in persuasion situations where informational social influence is being applied. An explanation has been proposed for gender differences in conformity. And once again, this is Eagley from 1987. Well, 1987 was 13 plus 24 was 37 years ago. First, gender may serve as a status variable in newly formed groups. Traditionally, the female gender role has seen as weaker than the male role, especially 37 years ago. In everyday life, males are more likely to hold positions of high status and power than women, especially 37 years ago. Men are more likely to be in the position of influencer and women in the position of influencee. Not so much today as it was 37 years ago. The lower status of the female role may contribute to a greater predisposition to conform on the part of women, especially in group pressure situations. Now, like I told you, we need to keep an eye on when all this research was done. So these are they're trying to create absolutes, and I don't think I don't think there ever were absolutes for one thing, but all of these things may be changing over time. Second, women tend to be more sensitive than men to conformity pressures when their behavior is under surveillance. That is, when they have to state their opinions publicly. And this is once again Eagley in 1981. When women must make their opinions public, they're more likely than men to conform. In the Ash paradigm, participants were required to state their opinions publicly. This favors women conforming more than men. And of course, that may not be true today. One of the things that we need to remember, we need to take look at all this research in its historical context. Ash conducted his classic experiment on conformity during the 1950s in the United States. The sociocultural climate that existed at the time favored conformity. The country was still under the influence of McCarthyism, which questioned individuals who did not conform to normal American ideals. And who's the one that determined what those ideals was? It's Joe McCarthy. And this is Joe McCarthy right here. They called him Tail Gunner Joe. He claimed that everybody was a communist. If anybody that didn't agree with him was a communist. And actually, we're kind of hearing the same thing out of the MAGA Republicans right now. They claim that if you're a Democrat, you're a socialist, you're a communist, that there's something wrong with you. They refer to people that aren't extreme right wing Republicans as libtards, liberal, retarded liberals is what they are trying to say. This climate may have contributed in significant ways to the levels of conformity that Ash observed. And and this is something that we have to remember that Ash was doing his research in the 1950s. But Eagley and Larson and Perrin and Spencer were doing their research in the 1980s. And one of the things we're going to find out is that the 1980s were more conforming than the 1970s. In just a minute. Evidence suggests that within the United States, rates of conformity vary with the socio-political climate. The conformity rate in the early 1970s was 62.5%. That is, 62.5% of the participants conformed at least once in the Ash-type experiment, compared to the rate of 78.9% during the early 1980s. So you can see it had increased by a marked amount, 16.4%. Compare this to Ash's 1956 rate of 76.5%, which is very similar to what was going on in the 1980s. Results like these suggest that conformity rates may be tied to the cultural climate in force at the time of the study. And this is something that we have to remember. And thank goodness they said this, because I've been saying it all along here. Within the United States, there are regional differences in conformity. Varnum in 2012 reviewed 91 conformity studies from 21 different states. Varnum found that conformity effects were significantly weaker in the western frontier states than in any other region of the country. According to Varnum, the sociocultural climate in the frontier states has a stronger bias toward nonconformity than in other states, resulting in a weaker predisposition to conform. And the two states that he was talking about were Idaho and Oregon, were the two states that are the least conforming. Next came Indiana and Minnesota, I think. Anyway, so this section of the country is the least conforming. I've lived in Montana. I can tell you that they're not very conforming people. I've lived in Nebraska and Iowa and Indiana and in Oklahoma and Mississippi, and I can tell you that this is the most conforming area. And California And Texas. Where else have I lived? Maryland. Okay. Anyway, I've lived a lot of places. An individual in a minority who expresses a deviant opinion consistently may be seen as having a high degree of confidence in their judgments. In experiments, majority participants rated minority members as more confident in their judgments than themselves. The consistent minority caused the majority to call into question the validity of their judgments. It all depends on how convinced you are. And that's what this joke says. We need to make recycling mandatory in our company. No, no, no. We really need to make recycling mandatory in our company. He's so persistent, we should look at the subject. They changed their mind. Two styles of minority influence consistency have been distinguished: rigid and negotiating. In the rigid style, the minority advocates a position that is counter to the norm adopted by the majority, but is unwilling to show flexibility. In the negotiating style, the minority, although remaining consistent, shows a willingness to be flexible. The rigid minority is received in a less positive way than a negotiating minority, perhaps leading to perceptions that the rigid minority's goal is to block the majority. Conversely, the negotiating minority may be perceived as having compromise as its goal. Clark found that minority influence increased when the original dissenting minority member was joined by a member of the majority. Another interesting aspect of minority influence is that a minority is more likely to voice a dissenting view when minority members are anonymous, such as on the computer, compared to face-to-face communication. The smaller the minority, the more likely it is that the majority will carefully process the minority's message. Oops. Judgments expressed by a minority may be more likely to make people think about the arguments raised. This suggests that two different processes operate: majority influence, which occurs almost exclusively on a public level, and minority influence, which seems to operate on a more private level. Majority influence, according to the two-process approach, operates through the application of pressure. As soon as majority pressure is removed, people return to their original beliefs. Majority influence does not necessarily have a lasting effect. Minority influence, according to the two-process approach, operates by making people think more deeply about the minority's position and consider a wider range of options. The dual process model suggests that there are different psychological processes underlying majority and minority influences. A competitive view, the single process approach to social influence, suggests that one psychological process accounts for both majority and minority influence. Latané suggested a social impact theory that social influence processes are the result of interaction between the strength, immediacy, and the number of influence sources. Compliance occurs when you modify your behavior in response to a direct request from another person. In compliance situations, the person making the request has no power to force you to do as they ask. Foot in the door technique, a social influence process in which a small request is made before a larger request, resulting in more compliance to the larger request than if the larger request were made alone. And this is a good example. Hello, sir. Would you have $2 for a bus ticket? And the guy doesn't say yes. And then this guy says, what time is it, sir? I need to catch the bus. Yes, it is 5:30 p.m. Thank you so much. I think I'm $2 short for the bus. Could you help me a bit? Let me check. And that's known as foot in the door technique. So you get your foot in the door with a simple request, and then you ask for the biggie. According to the self-perception hypothesis, the foot in the door technique works because agreeing to the first request causes changes in the perceptions of ourselves. Once we agree to the smaller original request, we perceive ourselves as the type of person who gives help in that particular situation, and thus we are more likely to give similar help in the future. Just like the guy asked for a bus to help him with the bus ticket. If you just ask for the bus ticket, nah. But if you ask him what time it is and he's nice enough to give you the time, then you go with the asking him for the money for the ticket. Door in the face technique is a social influence process in which a large request is made before a smaller request, resulting in more compliance in the smaller request than if the smaller request were made alone. And I get these all the time. Somebody will say, "Oh, thank you for donating last time. You donated $35. We were wondering if you could help this time to give us $50." And when you say no, then they ask you for the $35. And of course, you didn't give them the $35 before, so you just don't give them any. I don't. Well, I don't anyway. But theoretically, you'd be more willing to give them a small amount of money than the larger amount, and it makes them feel good. Some researchers have suggested that the door in the face technique works because the target of the influence attempt feels compelled to match the concession from the first larger request to the smaller second request made by the solicitor. The social psychological mechanism operating here is the norm of reciprocity. The norm of reciprocity states that we should help those who help us. And the idea is, of course, they ask for a lot of money, and now you need to, since they've taken the number down, and it's less money, then you're more likely to. But reciprocity has to do with you give something to me, I give something to you. When I was teaching high school, I had a license in Indiana, and it's like 39 states have this reciprocity agreement that if you have a teaching license in one state, then they'll give you a teaching license in another state. So, and that's known as reciprocity. Constructive obedience is a social norm that is valued in every culture. You simply can't have people doing whatever they want all the time. It would result in chaos. Consequently, we are socialized beginning as children to obey authority figures whom we perceive as legitimate. We internalize the social norm of obedience since that we usually obey rules and laws even when the authority figure isn't present. You stop at red lights even if the cops aren't around. And this is on the way to Amarillo from Dallas, this stop sign. Why it's there, nobody's exactly sure. But I've had to stop at that stoplight. When the rules and norms people are made to obey are negative, obedience is one of the blights of society. This kind of obedience is called destructive obedience. Destructive obedience occurs when a person obeys an authority figure and behaves in ways that are counter to accepted standards of moral behavior, ways that conflict with the demands of conscience. There is a tendency to attribute acts of destructive obedience to some abnormal internal characteristic of those who perpetrate such acts. Often we refer to these individuals as evil. But what does the term evil actually entail? Traditionally, notions of evil have been left to philosophers and theologians. However, social psychologists have given consideration to the concept and have developed social psychological concepts of evil. Zimbardo in 2004 has identified 10 principles inherent in obedience that can bring about this transformation to evil, providing an acceptable reason for the objectionable action, arranging for a written or verbal contract to perform action, providing individuals with meaningful roles to play, such as, well, this has to do with his prison guard experiment. And that's Zimbardo on the left with the Superman shirt on. Developing rules that must be followed, which are then used to justify action, altering language so that the individual believes he or she is not really hurting a victim, providing opportunities for passing responsibility on to others, diffusion of responsibility, absolving individual of direct personal responsibility for actions, beginning the process of obedience with small initial acts and then requiring larger acts later, increasing the level of harm to the victims incrementally over time, gradually changing the nature of the authority from reasonable to unreasonable, making it difficult to suspend obedience, and making the cost for disobedience high. Philip Zimbardo. Baumeister, and that's Baumeister on the right, and Vose in 2004, identify 4 roots of evil deeds: instrumentality, using violence to achieve a goal or solve a conflict; 2, threatened egotism, violence as a response to impugned honor or wounded pride; idealism, number 3, evil deeds performed to achieve some higher good; and 4, sadism, enjoying harming others, more likely to be reported by victims and perpetrators. And those are the 4 stages of evil. Staub suggests 3 other roots of evil: difficult life conditions, cultural and personal preconditions, and social political organization. Now, one of the things that you need to think about, when I have taught this class before, we've talked about genocide and different modern genocides that we have seen, from the Nazis trying to eradicate the Jewish population, the uprising in Rwanda, where the Hutus were butchering the Tutsis, the attack. In your book, they talk about the Serbs not only murdering all the men in a village, but then raping the women and trying to impregnate them so that they would be rejected by their religion. And they, of course, the Kosovars were Muslim, and a woman that is impregnated by someone other than her husband has to be discarded. And in the old days, they stoned them to death. So that's one of all of these evil things have happened over time. The shooter that machine gunned he had bump stocks. He machine gunned the music concert in Las Vegas and killed 57 people and wounded several hundred people. Is that evil? That's a lot of negative things have happened. The invasion of Israel on the 6th of October. Is that evil? Is the response that the Israelis are giving, is that evil? This is something that we have to think about. Staub points out that evil deeds are often perpetrated under difficult life conditions, such as economic depression and social disorganization. Cultural and personal factors are rooted in individual self-concept and traditional in-group, out-group separations in a culture. When one's self-esteem is threatened, that individual will move toward regaining a sense of control and power. This can be accomplished by establishing a sense of superiority of one's in-group over the out-groups. Totalitarian, authoritarian systems that institutionalize prejudice and discrimination are most likely to lead to evil deeds. One of the most important questions facing the world's inhabitants becomes, where does disobedience end and personal responsibility begin? The philosopher Hannah Arendt in 1965 was particularly interested in understanding the causes of the Holocaust. The Holocaust that she's referring to, of course, is the Nazi attempt to annihilate all Jews, to kill all the Jews in the world. Eventually, they rounded up and murdered 6 million Jewish people. There were in Europe there were probably 10 million Jewish people, and they were able to eradicate 6 million, which is a huge number. And the question is why and how and why did the Germans go along with this? Because a number of the Jewish people that they annihilated were German. They were from Germany. They lived in Germany. They were part of the German economy. How could Hitler's Nazi regime in Germany accomplish the murder of 6 million European Jews? Arendt argued that most participants in the Holocaust were not sadists or psychopaths who enjoyed the mass murder of innocent people, but were ordinary citizens subjected to complex and powerful social pressures. She covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi official responsible for the transportation of Jews to the death camps, and concluded that he was not the monster that many people made him out to be, but a commonplace bureaucrat like any other bureaucrat who did what he was told without questioning his orders. How can we be sure that the Holocaust, My Lai, and other mass atrocities were not caused solely by evil, psychopathic people, but by evil psychopathic people, but by powerful social forces operating on people of all types? Stanley Milgram decided to find out in what has become the most famous series of studies in social psychology. Stanley Milgram wanted to know how far people would follow an authority figure. After testing over 1,000 subjects, Milgram discovered that about 65% of the participants were willing to deliver the optimum punishment on the sham experimental subjects. And this is what it looked like. He strapped this guy into an electric harness, and this is the guy that was quizzing him. And every time he got something wrong, he would electrocute him with a little bit stronger electrical charge. And as you can see, there's a lot of them going across here. Anyway, 65% were willing to go all the way to the end. Milgram discovered that there were 4 factors to obedience: the victim's emotional distance from the individual. It was pretty easy because they were in a different room. There's the guy being shocked. Here's the guy doing the shocking. The authorities' closeness and legitimacy. In this case, it was Yale University. Whether or not the authority was institutionalized, and that's the Yale aspect of it. The liberating effect of a disobedient fellow subject. In other words, if they found out that somebody else had refused to do it, then they were more willing to refuse to do it. Emotional distance of the victim. Milgram's subjects acted with the least compassion when the shocked victims could not be seen. When there were no protests from the shocked victim, compliance was almost 100%. When the shocked victims were in the same room as the subject, compliance went down to 40%. That means only 60% of the people were not willing to do it, but 40%, 4 out of every 10 people, were willing to shock them all the way to the top. When the subject had to force the victim's hand on the shock plate, the compliance went down 30%, and that's what's happening here. Combat has proven that Milgram is correct in his assumptions. The more distant or depersonalized the enemy, the easier it is to kill them. Nations at war will attempt to dehumanize the enemy in order to force their soldiers to kill them. We refer to the Japanese as Japs, the Germans as Krauts. This is during World War II. We also, during World War I, we called the Germans Heinies. During the Vietnam and Korean War, we referred to our enemies as gooks or slopes or zipper heads. In Afghanistan and Iraq, we referred to the inhabitants, the people we were fighting, as ragheads, camel jockeys, and hajis. At the same time, researchers have found that it is more difficult to abort a pregnancy when the mother has seen an ultrasound of her fetus. Closeness and legitimacy of the authority. Milgram discovered that when the authority figure stayed in the room with the subject, obedience was high. When the authority figure was not in the room, the compliance dropped to 21%. When the authority figure was perceived as illegitimate, compliance dropped by 80%. The role of gender in obedience. Milgram found that women and men are obedient to authority at a similar rate. However, just like Ash, Subsequent research has shown mixed results. The gender of the authority figure had no impact on obedience except with younger subjects who were more obedient to a male authority figure. So the younger the person, the more likely that they see somebody as bigger than them, a male who's bigger than them, as an authority figure. Milgram's obedience effect has been supported by other cross-cultural research. Obedience among Jordanian adults was found to be 62.5%, comparable to the 65% rate found by Milgram among Americans, and among Jordanian children, 73%. Now, this is in 1977. The highest rate of obedience were reported among participants in Germany. In a replication of Milgram's original baseline experiment, 85% of German men obeyed the experimenter. Overall, it appears that obedience is an integral part of human social behavior. When doctors order, nurses obey. In an experiment that mirrored Milgram's, Hofling had 22 nurses given an order that they knew couldn't possibly be right. 21 of the nurses complied without delay. They were willing to overdose a patient because of the doctor's orders. The experiment was repeated 2 more times with similar results. That's 21 nurses out of 22. Because Milgram did his experiments at Yale University, many of the subjects claimed that it was the prestige of the institution that made them comply to such a heinous command. Milgram repeated his experiment as an unknown research group in Connecticut. Fewer people complied with the authority, but still 48% did. Liberating effect of group defiance, Milgram discovered that when the subjects observed others disobeying the authority figure, they were likely to do the same. A full 90% followed the lead of their rebellious colleagues, proving that group influence can be liberating. According to Ash and other researchers, the most conformity that can be generated by a group is when the group is made up of 3, 4, or 5 members. The more over 5, the less compliance that can be expected. When looking at evidence, a group is more likely to listen to several small groups than one large one. As Ash discovered with his work, it is very difficult to be the lone dissenter in a group. However, if there is one other dissenter in the group, it is much easier for the second person to also dissent. Experiments show that the 2 dissenters will actually feel very close and warm to each other. Jesus sent the disciples out in pairs, that's in Mark 1, 21 through 28, and the Church of Latter-day Saints, and that should be a capital L, sends out their missionaries in pairs. As a matter of fact, they're not allowed to be away from each other. The only time they can be alone is when they are going to the bathroom. Having someone else dissent gives a second dissenter courage to dissent on subsequent examples. Group cohesion, when someone from outside the group dissents, it is more powerful than when someone inside the group dissents. This may be because we see people in the same group easily following one another. They refer to that as cohesion or knee-jerk reaction. But outside the group, the likelihood of dissent is less strong. In an opposing group, the pressure is to be cohesive. Dissent from the group has much more power against us. The higher the status of the individual, the more impact their opinion will be. Often people will avoid agreeing with low status or stigmatized people. Research in Australia showed that people responded to a well-dressed person better than a poorly dressed individual, both in the jaywalking experiment and the survey experiment. In the jaywalking experiment, the poorly dressed model actually lowered the percentage of jaywalks because people didn't want to be identified with the poorly dressed individual. The jaywalk experiment, they were jaywalking. And when a well-dressed person jaywalked, it increased the number of people that tried to jaywalk. When a poorly dressed person, a homeless person, jaywalked, it actually decreased the number of people that jaywalked, as strange as that is. And the survey experiment had to do with trying to get people to take a survey. The better dressed the person was, the more attractive that they were, the more likely that they would get people to do their survey. Researchers were interested to find out if subjects were as group-oriented in a private response as when their response is public. Research shows that when response is public, people feel much more pressure to conform than if they are allowed to express their opinions in a secret ballot. It is easier to express your opinion in private rather than allowing yourself to be held to public ridicule. Prior commitment, anyone who has ever participated in a sporting event where there are judges, umpires, or referees knows that once an official makes a decision on a play, they very rarely will change their mind, even if they are obviously wrong. Researchers have discovered that once an individual makes a public decision, they very rarely recant their decision, even under overwhelming social pressure. Hence, arguing with an official may only steel their heart against you. The best course is to not set the official up for social ridicule. Milgram suggested that one factor contributing to the maintenance of obedience was that the individual in the obedient situation entered into an agentic state, which involves a person's giving up his or her normal moral and ethical standards in favor of those of the authority figure. The individual becomes an agent or instrument of the authority figure by focusing on the source of the authority, tuning in to the instructions issued, and then they reach an agentic state where they are part of the authority figure. It's like being hypnotized. Milgram suggested that in an agentic state, a person could experience role strain, apprehension about the obedience behavior. That could weaken the agentic state. In an obedient situation, the limits of the role we play are defined for us by the authority source. As long as we are comfortable with, or at least can tolerate that role, obedience will continue. If we begin to seriously question the legitimacy of that role, we begin to experience what Milgram called role strain. And role strain has to do with when you decide, that's all I can stand, I can't stand no more, and you become disobedient. When an authority source loses credibility, disobedience becomes possible. Kelman and Hamilton suggested that two kinds of psychological factors precede disobedience. Compromise of cognitive factors, the way that we think about obedience. In order to disobey, the individual involved in an obedience situation must be aware of alternatives to obedience. Disobedience is also preceded by motivational factors. An individual in the obedience situation must be willing to buck the existing social order and accept the consequences. And that is the operant concept right there, accepting the consequences. That's a lot of reasons why people don't speed, why they don't go through red lights. It's because they are not willing to accept the consequences. In other words, being arrested and potentially thrown in jail. Navarick in 2012 has suggested a three-stage model to describe the process of changing relationships among authority figures and subordinate. The first is priming, which involves feelings of distress associated with from the cues that you're getting. You're doing something that makes you feel bad, and this is the priming. The second is a decision point involving a choice of whether to continue with the obedience behavior or discontinue. You still haven't disobeyed yet, so you feel that it's wrong, and now you've decided to do something about it. The cues based on the immediate situation provide input to the decision point. And the third is the choice, which may involve immediately refusing to obey. And of course, that's you feel like you don't want to do it, then you decide you're not going to do it, and then you actually don't do it. You don't obey what you've been told. And that is the end of the chapter, which is a good thing because I have to go pick up my grandson. Where'd to go? Oh, it's still up.